All right, so we are continuing our study of the Sermon on the Mount here today. And in continuing this study, we are coming upon Matthew chapter 6. So we've just finished up chapter 5, and we're going to take a look at chapter 6 here today. And the three main topics, the three main subjects that Jesus addresses here in Matthew 6 are the topics of giving, you can call that benevolence or charity, charitable deeds, charitable acts, but giving, prayer. So he's going to spend some time thinking about prayer and what's not appropriate in prayer and what is appropriate in prayer. And he's also going to spend 2 or 3 verses in the end of Matthew 6, verses 16 through 18, at least our text today. He's going to be thinking about fasting. And so giving, prayer, and fasting, these are, almost giving and prayer, almost everyday things. Giving is not just something you do on the first day of the week, but it's something that we're able to do on a daily basis with other people and trying to just do good deeds, good acts, sharing with other people. That could be something as simple as a cup of cold water that Jesus mentions in Matthew 25. And so these are good, everyday, practical lessons for us to consider. So looking forward to the study here today. So to get it started, I wanted to quote from a couple of things here as we get started, and wanted to think about what John Smith writes in his workbook, because I think this helps prepare our thoughts for what the text is about in Matthew 6. And so he says this, in Matthew 5:20, okay, we're going back to Matthew 5, but you'll remember where Jesus told his disciples that their righteousness had to exceed that of the scribes and Pharisees. He proceeded to show a heart that was morally pure in contrast to the corrupt hearts of the Pharisees. The pure heart not only did not murder, it did not hate. It went beyond avoiding the act of adultery, it avoided the thought. The genuine disciple spoke honest and true words, for only those thoughts occupied his heart. Those who would follow Jesus have to give up the desire for vengeance and selflessly love their enemies. But he goes on to say in chapter 6, Jesus continues discussing this exceeding standard of righteousness and moves beyond moral rightness to religious rightness. Disciples are called upon to examine their motives for giving, praying, and fasting. In chapter 6, he says it's not an easy one. It guides the disciples through a painful and uncomfortable self-examination. It holds the mirror of God's word to his heart and reveals the secret contents of his control center. And I think if you really read Matthew 6 and you try to internalize it, that's very true. It really gets to the heart of our motives. And so I think it's a valuable passage for that reason. Now, one more quote, though, I want to read to you. I want to read it to you from Barclay, because I think he sets it up nicely, too. John Smith gives us some good context, looking back into Matthew 5 and thinking about the big picture of what Jesus is trying to get across with this whole sermon. The whole sermon is about exceeding the righteousness of the scribes and Pharisees, which, and going beyond physical acts to the heart, and thinking a little bit about our worship, thinking about the heart in worship. And so here, Barclay says this, to the Jew, there were 3 great cardinal works of the religious life, 3 great pillars on which the good life was based: almsgiving, prayer, and fasting. Jesus would not for a moment have disputed that. What troubled him was that so often in human life, the finest things were done from the wrong motives. And he goes on to say, it's the strange fact that these great cardinal good works readily lend themselves to wrong motives. It was Jesus' warning that when these things were done with the sole intention of bringing glory to the doer, they lost by far the most important part of their value. A man may give alms, not really to help the person to whom he gives, but simply to demonstrate his own generosity, and all to bask in the warmth of someone's gratitude and all men's praise. A man may pray in such a way that his prayer is not really addressed to God, but to his fellow men. And a man may fast not really for the good of his own soul, not really to humble himself in the sight of God, but simply to show the world what a splendidly self-disciplined character he is. A man may practice good works simply to win praise from men, to increase his own prestige, to show the world how good he is. And I think that really is a great summary of what we're about to study in Matthew chapter 6. What are our motives when we do good deeds for others? What are our motives when we pray? What are our motives even in fasting? Are we doing these things with proper and good motives? And so that's really the focus of what we want to take a look at here today. All right, so let's read Matthew 6, verses 1 through 4, and let's think a little bit about this text. This section is the almsgiving, the charity, the charitable deeds section. And so Jesus says this in Matthew 6, verse 1, "Take heed that you do not do your charitable deeds before men." Notice, by the way, there's this common pattern that Jesus will use here with these three examples. He says, do not do this, do this, okay? And so that pattern just shows up over and over again. And here he's talking about do not do, do. And that tells us a little bit about preaching, by the way. You got to tell people what not to do, and you got to show people what to do. And preaching without one or the other of those things is not preaching like Jesus, and it's not helpful to people. We have to be rebuked, and we have to be shown the right way. And Jesus does that here. Do not do your charitable deeds before men to be seen by them. Otherwise, you have no reward from your Father in heaven. Therefore, when you do a charitable deed, do not sound a trumpet before you, as the hypocrites do in the synagogues and in the streets, that they may have glory from men. Assuredly, I say to you, they have their reward. But when you do a charitable deed, do not let your left hand know what your right hand is doing, that your charitable deed may be in secret, and your Father who sees in secret will himself reward you openly. And so let's think a little bit about this text. We're going to start with the first question. These are always on the website, lccoc.net. You can download them off of there. I did send an email out as well today so that you can have those via your email. Next week's questions were in that email, and I'm sure Josh Nebel's loaned those up on the website for you as well, so that those will be ready. First question is this, and I thought this picture was just a perfect illustration of kind of what we're talking about. And in today's world where everybody's got their phone in their hand all the time, I mean, I've got mine right next to me, so I'm not pointing the finger at anybody. I've got my phone in my hand too, quite a bit. But in today's world where sometimes, because we like to photograph almost everything, sometimes we photograph ourselves doing these good deeds for other people, and sometimes I wonder if that's getting a little bit at the heart of what Jesus is condemning here. Do not do your charitable deeds before men. Not everybody needs to know every time you do something good. And so, how many times does Jesus say this in Matthew 6? He says, they have their reward. Anybody count that up? How many times does he say that? When I took a look at it, it looked like about 3 times to me. And one time in each section that we're thinking about here today, okay? So verse 2, he says, those who are basically doing their charitable deeds to be seen by other people, he says, if you're looking for glory from men, they have their reward. He says of those who are praying just so they can be seen by other people, if you're just doing it for the glory of other people, they have their reward. And if you're fasting and making sure that your cheeks look sunken in and you look sad and you haven't, washed your face and that sort of thing, you're doing it for attention, to try to get attention, to try to show people how pious and devoted to God you are, that you're willing to fast. He said, if you're doing this just so people can see you, you have your reward. So in each of these sections, Jesus basically says, if you're looking for gratification and glorification and honor from men, then you'll get it. There'll be people who will like that every time you do something good and tell other people about it, and they'll clap for you and they'll pat you on the back and they'll applaud you. But that should not be the motive behind why we do what we do in serving the Lord, for the praise and the glory of men. John wrote in the chat box, which you're welcome to use, he says, instant gratification is a danger that we all face. As Christians, we shouldn't be looking for that. And that is a part of sometimes what we get with in the social media world, I think today too. We get kind of that instant gratification, those likes, that applause. And Jesus is getting it at the heart of that a little bit, asking us to be careful about that. The term reward is a word that means paid in full. So think about that. Jesus is saying that if that's what you're shooting for, if that's the reward that you're concerned with, then it will be paid in full. In other words, there's going to be no payment after that. So that's a scary thought when you think about there's a lot better reward than the instant gratification, the applause of men that we might get here on earth. Think about this next quote here. Let me jump into it. This is from Tack Chumley. But Tack, sorry, I call him Tack because I know Tack. And so Tack is his nickname, but his commentary says Kenneth. Okay, so Kenneth Chumley. He says, in Matthew, a hypocrite is identified as one who loves to be noticed and commended and does good works to glorify self. And he's got some great verse citations here. So he's looking at, in Matthew, what is a hypocrite? And Jesus calls these people hypocrites in verse 2. If you're doing this just to be seen by men, he says that's hypocritical because you want the honor from men. That's hypocritical if we're just interested in the applause of men. And so a hypocrite is, and he this is a great sermon outline, really. I mean, if any of you guys ever want to preach a sermon, he makes some great points from these passages in this one little paragraph. He says, a hypocrite loves to be noticed and commended and does good works to glorify self. He also operates by a double standard. He excuses in himself what he condemns in others. And he's got some great verse citations there where you can see that. That's hypocritical. Jesus called that out. In the name of God, he breaks the word of God. In chapter 15, Jesus calls that out. That's something we're actually going to study in our Sunday Bible study here in about a week. He masks his wickedness as sincerity. So the hypocrite masks his wickedness as being sincere. Few hypocrites, now listen to this, few hypocrites are consciously hypocritical. A lot of people don't even realize they're being hypocritical. In fact, they generally view themselves as the only true believers. The scribes and Pharisees, they didn't believe they were hypocrites. They were sincere in their hypocrisy, and therein lay the lethalness of their sin. That's what's so lethal about it, is we're oftentimes blind to our own hypocritical acts and deeds and motives. And Jesus is making it very clear here. If this is why you're doing what you're doing, that's hypocritical. So if you can't see it in yourself, Jesus sees it in you. Jesus sees it in these people. And this is why this passage, it can be hard to read sometimes because we can see some of this in ourselves at times. All right. Any thoughts that you guys have? I've been doing most of the talking here today, so feel free to jump into the conversation, unmute yourself, or type something in that chat box. Go ahead. I hear somebody.
Josh, everything you said was right on point tonight so far.
Well, thank you. Anybody else got anything? Thanks, John.
I look at Acts 5 and Ananias and Sapphira as a comparable verse to this. It's not exactly the same, but it gives us some of what the motive is behind their action, and quite frankly, the way God didn't like it.
Yeah. I think that's a great point. Ananias and Sapphira, they wanted to pretend that they gave more to help out their fellow brothers and sisters than they did. And why would they have done that? They didn't have to do that. But I think part of the reason lays in their motive. They wanted to be given great credit as being extremely generous people. And it was already generous that they were giving, but they wanted to pretend they were giving more than they were. And I think you're right. They lie about it, and behind that was an evil motive. It's a good point. Thank you.
We really have to watch out for your motive, because when and it's such a common practice in today's time that it can be overlooked. I grew up in the Boy Scouts, and it was kind of an unspoken rule. If you wanted your fellow scouts to help you with your Eagle Scout project, you better go to theirs. And I just can't help but think of we can be guilty of helping. You've kind of already touched on this, of helping people out, when in reality we don't have an interest of God so much in mind, as much as we want people to say, well, that person's a good person, or well, they're going to return the favor to me someday. And I think we should let's be considerate to each other, but let's also look at what our motives are when it comes to helping people.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Thank you, Robert, because I actually had that question. I actually had the question, like, what's a real way biblically that we can ask ourselves, and kind of guard against that with ourselves, and maybe in a way that we don't really know what our motives are, or that we're doing something hypocritically. So that was my question.
Yeah. Well, great. Thanks, Robert. So good points, guys. Now, as we move on through this, when it comes to charitable giving, what are the possible motivations behind the deed, and in what ways can we sound the trumpet? Jesus, I think, is speaking metaphorically when he says that. I don't know if there's I haven't seen any documented examples of people literally sounding trumpets. Maybe I just have missed it. But I think it's just a figure of speech. The idea, don't toot your own horn is the best way I can kind of put it when it comes to your giving. So what are some ways that we might see that in real life?
Well, we don't need trumpets today. We've got social media to tell about all of the things we've done.
Okay. Yeah. So sometimes it's a social media thing. I'll give you guys an example from where I lived in Indiana. There was a big it was a community church in the community where I was, and they had this giving day. Once a year they had a giving day, and that's nice. They would rake people's yards and just help people out who needed help, create a list, and just members went out and helped people. But they printed up T-shirts, with the name of the church and with Giving Day on it. They encouraged their members to all take pictures, to plaster it all over social media, because people would think about what a great church this is. And it seems just exactly what Jesus is talking about here. Is this really to help people, or is this a way to pat ourselves on the back and get people to praise us? You don't have to do that. If you really want to help people, and don't do it for the glory. Now, I have a question, and I'll just ask you guys this. Generally, just because we do good things for other people, if other people find out, is that a bad thing? If other people find out and praise us or mention it, what do you think about that?
No, I think it's a motivation for sometimes, like, hey, somebody's doing that, I should be doing something like that, so it kind of like, maybe brings to my attention something that needs to be done in that case. But I also wanted to make a comment, what you were talking about before. People, when you talk to them in the church, it seems like those who wanted, if you're talking to people at congregations, they always seem to find a way to let you know what they did for somebody in the congregation. Hey, I went over and checked on them, or I called on them, and so the action itself is great. That's what needed to be done. But sometimes I think we just say things to other people, or people find out about it just to let everybody else know what they're doing or something, and like you said, it's the motivation behind it, I guess.
Mhm. Yeah, it's a good point. Good point.
Hello?
Hello, I hear somebody.
Yeah, this is Kevin.
Okay, hey Kevin.
It looks like it's just all a matter of motive, because Jesus said, let your light shine, that
Mhm.
others may see your good works and
Mhm.
glorify God.
Yeah, yeah. And so there's nothing wrong with your light shining. I think that's a great point. And Michelle mentioned that in the chat box here too. She says, "Let your light shine before men, that they will do good as well." But yeah, it is a question of motive. I like. There's a proverb that I like. It says, "Let another man praise you, and not your own lips." And so there's nothing wrong with praising others. In fact, I think it's great to make a point to praise other people for the good that they've done. But there's a difference between praising other people for some good that they've done and praising yourself for the good that you've done. It seems very self-motivated. So just some things to think about when it comes to that. Certainly from Jesus, he says this: when you do a charitable deed, don't let your right hand know what your left hand is doing. And so to me, that seems to encourage spontaneity in giving, and it seems to encourage some sense of secrecy, personally in our giving. By the way, did Jesus commend a widow who gave money at the treasury publicly? I mean, how many times have we sat in services and we've heard someone talk about the widow who put in all that she had? Jesus noted her. So if Jesus noted someone and praised someone else for what they did and commended them, there's certainly nothing wrong with us doing that for the sake of others. It's when it's intended to praise and glorify ourselves. Jesus also said this, that when you've done everything that there is to do, you're just servants. We're just unprofitable servants. And so, all right. Other thoughts that you guys have? We could go on about this a long time, I bet. All right. Let's move forward as we keep skipping through this a bit. And Wiersbe, I think, touches on exactly what we just touched on. He says, if our motive is to get the praise of men, then like the Pharisees, we will call attention to what we are doing. Somebody out there has a pen and likes to use it. So be careful if you've got the annotation on there. If our motive is to get the praise of men, then like the Pharisees, we will call attention to what we are doing. But if our motive is to serve God in love and please him, then we will give our gifts without calling attention to them. Does this mean that it's wrong to give openly? Must all giving be anonymous? Not necessarily, for everyone in the early church knew that Barnabas had given the income from the sale of his land. And when the church members laid their money at the apostles' feet, that wasn't done in secret. The difference, of course, was in the motive and the manner in which it was done. He actually mentions Ananias right after this. I just didn't have room for the quote on here. So John Bastoso was the head of the quote anyway. So it's great. All right. Next text. This is about prayer. You get into Matthew 6, 5 through 8. So we talked about what not to do with charitable deeds and what to do with charitable deeds. And now we're going to think about how not to pray and how to pray. When you pray, you shall not be like the hypocrites, for they love to pray standing in the synagogues and on the corners of the streets, that they may be seen by men. Assuredly, I say to you, they have their reward. But you, when you pray, go into your room. When you shut your door, pray to your Father who is in the secret place. And your Father who sees in secret will reward you openly. And when you pray, do not use vain repetitions as the heathen do, for they think that they will be heard for their many words. And therefore, do not be like them, for your Father knows the things you have need of before you ask him. Okay, so we're going to start with that section, and we'll get into the Lord's Prayer, as it's called. I actually think a better title would be the Disciples' Prayer, because it's for the disciples. But we'll get into that here in just a minute. What were some of the bad habits, though, that the hypocrites did as they prayed? What were some of the bad habits Jesus mentions that we need to think about?
Seen by men.
Again, a motive issue, just praying so that you can be seen by men. What else? I mentioned something in verse 7. What was that? Go ahead.
The effort was to be out there where everybody would see, not so much what you said. And of course, it gets back to the motives, but nonetheless, they're posturing. It's all about the act of being seen.
Right. So prayer needs to not become a show. Perhaps that's a good way, the way I look at verse 5, they're praying standing in the synagogues. Here they are in front of everyone. It becomes almost a show. They're on the corners of the streets in the most present place that they can be, trying to show people how pious they are, stopping in the middle of the street. Kevin mentions this in the chat box. Your prayers not to be choreographed to attract attention. So I think that's another good way to put it there. There's a danger in prayer, and one of the dangers, I think, is the danger of formalization. If we only pray when we're in public and when other people see us, Jesus says there's something wrong with your prayer life. Prayer needs to be something that's not just done in front of other people to try to show people that we're pious and devoted to God. It's something that if we're truly devoted to God and we truly believe in the power of prayer, we will do it alone in secret without anyone ever knowing. And so a hypocrite is someone who does it in public but doesn't have a private prayer life. So formalization is a danger. There's also a danger in connecting prayer to the assembly. If that's the only time we ever hear prayers or pray ourselves, there's something wrong with that. I mean, the synagogues were the places of worship. He says, I don't want you just to pray in the place of worship or hear prayers in the place of worship. I want this to happen in your home, in your closet. And so what does Jesus encourage with our prayer habits instead of what was commonly seen among religious leaders?
Not to make it a show, but to have a talk with God where you're one-on-one with God at home, when you're taking of a meal, when you're thinking about somebody at church or your family. It doesn't need to be a public display. Our relationship, our salvation is worked out by us and God. And so that's the same with our prayer life. It needs to be between us and God most times. Not to say that, public prayer is wrong. Obviously, it's part of our worship service. Jesus did it publicly also. So, but I think he's making a good point here about we ought to be doing it in our private life too.
Mm-hmm. Good thoughts. There's something else that's said in verse 7, don't use vain repetitions. What automatically comes to some of your minds when you think of vain repetitions in prayer?
Catholics and Lutherans.
Okay. I mean, who said that, Mother? That's
Brianna.
Brianna. Okay. So Leslie also put Catholic in the group chat. But yeah, I mean, that's what I'm getting at, is that's a lot of times what we think of when we think of vain repetitions. But let me ask you just an honest question here. Do any of you have kind of just this one rote prayer that's almost like a routine prayer where you say almost the exact same phrases, the exact same thing throughout almost the entire prayer? Anybody ever have that?
This is Brianna again. I had that growing up, and because I was, raised in a bunch of different denominations. But when I actually met Daniel and started going to Church of Christ, I thought it was so bizarre to have just like random, like on the spot prayers, because I was so used to like the rote standard prayers, which it's dangerous because you have it memorized and the words don't mean anything to you anymore. And you're just saying it just because that's what you're supposed to do.
Yeah. And I think that's a great point. And the point that I want to make from that is that it's not just, we point the finger at maybe other denominations because say the rosary or say the Lord's Prayer, 10 times, or they say the exact same prayer at every single service. And yeah, that's probably part of what a vain repetition could be, but we can be guilty of the same thing. It's just that we don't have the same prayer if we're saying the exact same things. And I read a quote that I think was really fantastic. And it said this: all of us have one routine prayer in our system. And once we get rid of it, then we can really start to pray. And I thought that was a fantastic quote. Once we get rid of that, prayer that we were taught when we were kids, and we kind of say the same thing, and we just kind of go through it by rote, then we can really start pouring our heart out to God for ourselves and on behalf of others. And that's what Jesus wants. He wants you to go to the secret place and not offer the same prayer that you just do in front of other people. It's a rote prayer. He wants you to really learn how to pray. Now, thinking about that, let's take a look at our next question here. Why would it be a good idea to shut our door when we pray? What do you think about that? Why does he say shut your door, just you and God?
No interruptions.
No interruptions. Okay, that's a great point. Good. Leslie
Down the
makes a
distractions.
Go ahead, Paul.
Keep down the distractions.
Yeah, that's good. To not be distracted. You're having a conversation with God. Is there any conversation that's more important than your conversation with God? Leslie makes a great point here. She says, writing out your prayers can help avoid that, avoid the prayer being rote and routine. I think that's a great point. I was listening to a good lesson by David Bain a couple weeks ago. They're doing a teen Devo on Tuesday nights. I think I advertised that to a few people. But he had a point about having a prayer journal. And the idea of it is writing out your prayers. But he pointed out, he said, after you write those prayers out, go back to that prayer journal a month or two later and notice how God's answered those prayers. It can be very encouraging when you've actually written out what you want to say and pray to God about how he's answered them. Robert says in the chat box, sometimes there are things we should work out with God alone. I think that's a great point. There's a lot of things I might pray about my heart and things that are going on in my life and my heart and in my mind that I don't want everybody else to know about. Not everybody else needs to know about that. And sometimes it's good to go to a secret place where it's you and God, and you ask God to help you through that. Sarah Budd mentions it's to make an intimate setting for the two of you. And that's a great point. John says, never really thought of it that way. And Mark says it places you in a more intimate setting with God. I don't know if Mark and Tina just copied and pasted Sarah's comment there, but you guys are on the same wavelength, so that's great.
Hey, Josh.
Any more thoughts? Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, Josh.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know about the rest of everyone, but every day seems to be different. So there's always different circumstances and different things to talk about at God when you lay your head at night. It's not like repetition. Every day is the same. There's always different things to talk to God about.
Yeah. And that's very true. Very true. So you shouldn't have the exact same prayer because your circumstances, your situations, what you're going through that day are always often different. And
Josh?
Yeah.
Josh, I was just going to add one thing. Something I thought about here for this and that I've thought about before. When as men we go up to say a public prayer or do other public things in the service, of course I want to do a good job. I try to prepare for that and plan for that. But I'm almost embarrassed if someone says, hey, that was a good prayer, or because I feel like in many cases I can be too focused on on doing it and making sure everything's right. Whereas some of the men that we have get up and you can just, they're just whole heart is out there. And I admire that quality in some of the men that get up and speak, that it's just everything's out there. And I just appreciate that. So it's a catch-22. We want to do the right thing, but the focus is not what we're saying. It's his word through us.
Right. Great points. I appreciate the good comments. Just a couple of more ideas, and we're going to move on to the actual disciples' prayer. But some things are too private. I mentioned that. Some things are just sometimes other people don't understand what you're going through. I think about Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane. even his own disciples didn't fully comprehend what he was going through mentally and emotionally. And he, even if they are not with him, he's still praying to God the Father and asking for his help. But he's willing to do it privately. It's also hard to be proud when you're alone with God. I mean, if I'm in my closet and nobody else is hearing my prayer, I'm certainly not praying just so other people can hear me and be impressed with my eloquence or my flowery speech or all the adjectives that I can think of to describe God. I mean, it's you and God, and that takes personal faith, and it says something about your personal faith. Joni Pike says this: pray as if everything depends on God, and work as if everything depends on us. So put prayer in action. I think that's a great statement. So great thoughts. Great thoughts.
Bring up
Yeah, go ahead. Sure.
At the risk of backtracking just a little bit, I thought about the public prayers that you mentioned, and I looked at this article once, and I don't know how true it still is today. I could be wrong on this, but apparently Sundays are one of the worst days when it comes to tipping in restaurants. There are religious places out there. They place a fake dollar bill into the place where the tip's supposed to be, and it's really a link to a website, but it initially fools the server at first. That has caused a lot of uproar. There have been servers that have really requested, I don't want to be working on Sundays. I can only imagine, how many of them pray publicly, yet they don't show consistency when it comes to being respectful to the server, you appropriately tipping them. Just something I wanted to throw out there.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. I've actually heard that same study, Robert, that there's been a study, some of the worst tippers are Christians. So if you're talking to other people that are serving you about coming to worship, make sure that you're more generous with them than the Gentiles that are talking to them. Okay. So yeah, good thoughts. So let's take a look here at Matthew 6:9-15, because Jesus talks about here's how you can pray. So we mentioned in each of these three topics, giving, prayer, and fasting, Jesus says here's what not to do and here's what to do. And so here in verses 9-15, in this manner therefore pray, our Father in heaven, hallowed be your name. Your kingdom come, your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our debts as we forgive our debtors. And do not lead us into temptation, but deliver us from the evil one. For yours is the kingdom and the power and the glory forever. Amen. For if you forgive men their trespasses, your heavenly Father will also forgive your trespasses. But if you do not forgive men their trespasses, neither will your Father forgive your trespasses. All right. So let's take a look at this. Just we're going to go a little quickly here because we're going to get into the fasting point here at the end. But Kevin says this. I want to read a couple of these comments from the chat box. Discussion of prayer is difficult. We aren't intending to criticize, but to help each other do better. We may learn to speak very casually, and some may think that is more sincere. Another may speak using Bible phrases, and that may be very spiritually focused. We're just trying to do our best. And I think that's a good point too, making sure that we have enough grace for other people as they pray, and not being overly critical. So good thoughts. Sarah Butt also said, prayer alone is a way to open your heart to God, to pray with others and with an open and tender heart. It's a sign of maturity. So thank you for those. Anything about the Lord's Prayer that pops out to you as you think about this prayer here in Matthew 6:9-13?
I think more than anything, it's about the forgiving of others part, because he ends the model prayer, or he ends that template, and then he goes back and he touches on that forgiving part again. So I think that's very interesting.
Okay, good. That's a part of prayer, is asking for strength to forgive. Do you think that's a pretty common struggle with some people? I mean, every day we might be faced with whether it be the guy that's honking his horn at us that we get angry with, or the coworker, or the someone in our family, even somebody in our church. I mean, every day we can have thoughts, or we can be tempted to withhold forgiveness, and the fact that that is a part of our daily prayer, a pattern for our prayer that needs to be part of it, is God, help me to forgive and help other people to forgive me, because sometimes I'm the offender. And so that's a great point. Other thoughts?
I've always had this taught, Josh, as, it's basically an outline for a prayer where you start out with thanking God, praising God, thanking God. You start out, saying, thank you for the blessings that you've given us. And then you move to asking God for whatever it is that you're going to petition. And then you bring it back around to, God being holy and thanking him. And so it's, whenever I've looked at that, it's not necessarily the words that are being said, but the pattern of it. So it's, it's one of those things for me when I pray, it feels like it's a good outline of how I want to guide the organization of my prayers and the thoughts of my prayers.
I think that's a great point, and something you can do that I would encourage you. If sometimes people are afraid, if I get in front of people and have to pray, what do I say? What should I say? And I think it's great to look at this prayer. Look at what Jesus said, and he didn't say pray this precisely. It wasn't to be necessarily a rote, memorized prayer, but in this manner. So looking at it as an outline is a great point. And you're right, taking the main topics and just trying to include topics like those as you pray, personally and publicly, whatever it might be. It's a great pattern. A couple of things that I would mention to you. This prayer is not long. I mean, time yourself saying this prayer. So prayer doesn't have to be really long to be acceptable. I've heard people apologize. I'm sorry my prayer was so short. Well, the Lord's prayer was short. He didn't apologize for it. It was okay. Don't worry about that. It's the heart that matters. It's not the length of the prayer. It doesn't contain hundreds of adjectives. There's not a lot of adjectives in this prayer. It's not for any set person. It's not for any set place. It's not for any set time. So the generalness of it, I think, is helpful as we think about a guideline. There's a point that Wiersbe made here that I had never even thought of, but he said it's worth noting that there are no singular pronouns in this prayer. They are all plural. It begins with our Father. And when we pray, we must remember that we are part of God's worldwide family of believers. We have no right to ask for ourselves anything that would harm another member of the family either. There's nothing like that in this prayer. So I like that idea. The idea that it's plural. Let's realize that we're praying something that is for the good of God's people, God's world, God's creation. This is also from Chumley, and he notes something that I think was a good point, and kind of takes a very balanced view of prayer length. He says, while Christians are to pray without ceasing, a prayer's length is not the determinative factor in its effectiveness. The prayer in verses 9 through 13 has 66 words. The prayer in John 17 has about 600 words. In chapter 14, Christ prayed all night. I guess John didn't want to record that one. He would have got his hand cramped. The crucial thing is not the quantity of words, and that's the point we want to take from this. It's the quality of the heart doing the praying. So something to think about. We're going to skip over this next section because this could be a whole sermon in itself, and we're going to try to jump down. We already touched on forgiveness, so we're going to jump down into Matthew 7 and then Matthew, the end of Matthew 6's text. Matthew 7, we want to include this with this part of this lesson because this seems focused on prayer. Ask and it will be given to you. Seek and you will find. Knock and it will be open to you. For everyone who asks receive, he who seeks finds, to him who knocks it will be open. What man is there among you who, if his son asked for bread, would you give him a stone? Or if he asked for a fish, would you give him a serpent? And if you then, being evil, know how to give good gifts to your children, how much more will your Father who is in heaven give good things to those who ask him? And therefore, whatever you want men to do to you, do also to them, for this is the law and the prophets. All right. So let's think about this short text as well. What does Matthew 7:7-8 teach us about our attitude toward prayer? What does Jesus say to do?
We need confidence that he will answer.
Yeah, I think that's a great summary. Yeah, have confidence that he will answer. The comparison that he makes is that, dads aren't perfect. Dads sometimes can be selfish. But even if, father's son says, hey, Dad, I'm hungry, can I have a piece of bread? You're not going to give him a rock. You're going to give him what he wants. And our Father in heaven is a much better dad than any of us will ever be. He's a much better father. He's benevolent. He's giving. He's good. He's an awesome God. And so if you, who can sometimes be evil, are willing to give good things to your children, don't you think God, who's always good, is going to want to answer your prayer? And so there's 3 verbs: ask, seek, and knock. So keep asking, keep seeking, keep knocking. All right, let's get to the last section of our text. So I'm sorry if I'm moving a little quickly, but we're getting cramped on time here at the end. All right, verses 16 through 18. These are the last 3 verses we're going to take a look at. Moreover, when you fast, do not be like the hypocrites, with a sad countenance, for they disfigure their faces, they may appear to men to be fasting. Assuredly, I say to you, they have their reward. But you, when you fast, anoint your head and wash your face, so that you do not appear to men to be fasting, but to your Father who is in the secret place, and your Father who sees in secret will reward you openly. All right, let's think about this text. Are there any religious groups or any religious practices that kind of pop out to you a little bit when you read this text?
I think of Lent and Ash Wednesday. I think Ash Wednesday is a very out there sort of thing, and then Lent. Well, I gave up sugar, I gave up whatever, so I can't have these things for Lent, and so that's one of the first things that comes to mind.
Yeah.
I'm thinking of I was thinking of the Muslims where they just went through Ramadan, where they're not allowed to eat. They're fasting all day from sunrise to sunset. And so they do this yearly as part of their religious.
So the Nevilles mentioned that as well, Dave. So Muslims, Lent, and Lent was my automatic go-to when I think of this passage. It doesn't seem to be something that's done privately. It's something that's done publicly, almost in a showy fact. I gave this up, and almost like we're bragging on ourselves, how good we're trying to be, and how we're doing this for God. I mean, because God is very happy with us when we don't eat chocolate, I guess, for a few days. God or Jesus is getting at that motive, perspective, that does things so that people will notice. Jesus doesn't say, do this so people can notice. He actually says, I want you to do this in a way that nobody even knows you're doing it. Because if you're doing it for the right reasons, it's not about other people noticing you. If you're fasting for the right reasons, not about other people knowing that you're fasting. It's about you trying to be self-disciplined with God. And so as we close things out, let's just kind of finish this up with the last couple questions here. Jesus corrects this practice. Now, I want you to think about this. In the following scriptures, and we don't have time to look at every one of these because I try to make sure you guys are out of here by 8 o'clock. But in the following scriptures, what are some of the purposes of fasting? Some of the purposes.
One of the first things in my mind is when David and Bathsheba, when their child, pronouncement has been brought to them for judgment that the child's not going to live. We see David fasting.
Okay. So it's connected with mourning. That's the 2 Samuel passage. It is connected with national penitence. So in Judges 20, 1 Samuel 7, Nehemiah 9, it's a national thing. It's something that they're doing as a country. They also fasted in Exodus 24, the Daniel 9 passage. It was preparation for revelation. God was going to reveal something specifically there. I believe it was to Moses and then to Daniel. And so they fasted as they prepared to receive this. But these are all spiritual purposes. I'm mourning for my sin. We are being penitent because our country, our nation has sinned, and we're being punished for it. We are fasting so that we can receive God's revelation and be fully focused on that, not on food and not on stuffing our bodies and filling our bellies, but we want to be fully focused on the revelation of God. Every one of these examples was to draw us closer to God. The purpose of it was not to impress men. And so fasting in the Bible, and we could probably spend a big lesson on fasting, but fasting can be a very valuable and oft neglected tool. It teaches us self-discipline, teaches us to do without things, causes us to appreciate the simple gifts in life, takes us away from our time-consuming habits, gives us time to focus on God's will. I'd be willing to bet that a lot of people fast without even realizing it sometimes. Have you ever gone through something that's, due to sin or some sin in your family? Or maybe it's a matter of grief and mourning, and you just can't eat. And you spend time thinking about it, maybe trying to focus on God's word, maybe spend time in prayer. You might fast without even realizing that you're fasting, but so that you can devote yourselves to spiritual purposes. Michelle has a question here, so I want to throw this out. She says, do you think there's a problem with getting a group of sisters to fast together for a cause? Are you saying the scriptures implying it's by yourself, only in secret then? I think you definitely see times where the group, there's a group fasting, but at the same time, I think what's being addressed here in Matthew 6 is our practice of privately fasting. If you truly are doing something because you want to devote yourself to God and to prayer to God and to meditate upon God, don't do it just so you can get attention from other people. Any other thoughts on that? Some of you might have thoughts on that. All right, Michelle. Well, I guess that's the official answer then. So I'm sorry. That wasn't a very in-depth answer. Well, let's think about some of this stuff at another time. I mean, there's definitely a lot of material here. If you guys have more questions, I want you to know that just because we don't always answer every single question here, or maybe you were wanting to know something about some nuance of the text, feel free to email me those questions, text me, give me a call after class sometime, or even tomorrow, and we can always talk about this in a lot more depth. I'm pretty much out of time tonight, and so next week I want to encourage you to read Matthew 6 verses 19 through 34. We're going to be studying from there, and hope you can join us then. Make sure you check your email. I'm sure Josh is going to send out an email. Our sermon on Sunday morning is going to be about our words, and going to be thinking about what one of the questions Jesus asked, where he says, how can you being evil speak good things? And so we're just going to focus on our words and our tongues and being very disciplined and careful with what we say. And so I encourage you to listen to that on Sunday, share that with other people, and look forward to seeing you guys hopefully sooner rather than later. Any thoughts? Anybody want to close us out with any questions? Any final words of wisdom?
This really isn't a competition. I mean, Paul does compare our fight in this world to a race, but we're not racing against each other. We're here to help each other out. And, there may be things that, we cannot do as well as perhaps another brother or sister can. but we certainly should not be trying to parade our deeds to see, how much I've done as opposed to what someone else has done. Just a thought.
Yeah. Good point as well. Good point as well. Well, thank you, everybody. Thank you. Take some time to go to your prayer closet tonight. Pray in private. Take some time to give to somebody who you know is in need. Not everybody has to know about it, but think about some way that you can give and help others daily. And then when things are rough, and some of you have been facing some rough times, maybe financially, or you're in a different situation now, take the time to fast and pray and devote yourself to God. So let's take what Jesus teaches us here in Matthew 6 and put it into practice in our lives. So thanks for joining us, guys. Look forward to seeing you next time. Thank you.